The call came on a Wednesday, which was already the wrong day for good news. Tanner Hollis had learned to read days the way he used to read engine diagnostics. Certain combinations of factors told you, before you even opened the hood, that something was going to cost you more than you were ready to pay. Wednesdays had a particular feel to them. Not Mondays, which were honest about being hard. Not Fridays, which at least had the decency to offer something at the end. Wednesdays just sat there in the middle of the week, neither promising nor forgiving, and that was exactly the kind of day a man got a phone call that changed everything. He was underneath a '98 Silverado when his phone buzzed on the concrete floor beside him. The name on the screen was Petra Voss. Not someone he'd spoken to in 4 years, not someone he'd expected to hear from again after the way things ended at Meridian Automotive. He almost let it go to voicemail. He should have let it go to voicemail. But something, maybe the Wednesday of it all, made him wipe his hands on his shop rag and answer. Tanner. Her voice was exactly the same, composed, precise, like she was reading from a brief she'd already reviewed 3 times. I have something I need you to look at. He sat up, bumping his forehead on the undercarriage, and said nothing for a moment. What kind of something? He said finally. Engines, she said. 7 of them. I'm having them brought to your location Thursday morning. He almost laughed. 7 engines. As if she were describing a shipment of office supplies. Petra, he said. I run a garage in Clover Falls. I do oil changes and brake jobs and the occasional transmission. I'm not exactly set up for. I know what you're set up for, she said. I also know what you used to be set up for. I need someone who understands what these engines are, not what they look like right now, what they are. He didn't answer. Thursday morning, she said again. And then she hung up. Tanner Hollis was 38 years old, and he had built his life twice. The first time, he'd built it the way everyone told him to. Engineering degree from Michigan State, a job at one of the big Tier 1 suppliers outside Detroit. Then a senior position at Meridian Automotive, where he spent 11 years working on high-performance engine development for motorsport clients. He had a wife named Beth and a daughter named Rosalind and a house with a 2-car garage that he kept cleaner than the kitchen. He had a salary that made his father uncomfortable and a title that made his mother proud and a future that looked, from the outside, like a straight line going up. Then Beth got sick, and then Beth died. And then Tanner packed his daughter and his tools into a moving truck and drove south and west until the exits started sounding like places people actually lived in. And he stopped in Clover Falls, Tennessee, because Rosalind had fallen asleep, and he was too tired to keep going. The second life was smaller. He rented a cinder block building on the edge of town that used to be a tire shop. He fixed what people brought him. He picked Rosalind up from school at 3:15 every afternoon and made dinner most nights and occasionally burned it and told her it was supposed to taste like that. She was 9 when they moved. She was 13 now, and she had her mother's habit of seeing through things, which meant she saw through him more often than was comfortable. The garage was called Hollis Auto. He hadn't spent much time on the name. The engines arrived Thursday morning as promised, on a flatbed truck driven by a man who didn't say much and left as soon as the last pallet was down. 7 of them, lined up in the thin October light outside the garage bay. Tanner walked the row slowly, hands in his pockets, not touching anything yet. They were Meridian M7 series racing engines. He recognized them immediately, the way you recognize the handwriting of someone you used to know. He had worked on the original design spec for the M7 program back in 2016. He had spent 14 months on compression ratio refinement alone. These engines were his in every way that didn't involve paperwork. They looked at a glance like scrap, corrosion on the block faces, seized components, grime packed into places where grime had no business being. One of them had what looked like heat damage across the top of the head. Another was missing its intake manifold entirely. But Tanner crouched down next to the first one and pressed his palm flat against the side of the block and felt the weight of it, the density of the casting, and he knew they weren't scrap. They were sleeping. He stood up and called Petra back. Where did these come from, he said. Does it matter? It does if someone's going to come looking for them. A pause. They were scheduled for destruction under the M7 program decommission. I pulled them before the order was executed. Legally, they belonged to no one at this point. The program was dissolved. Why did you pull them? Another pause, longer this time. Because I knew what they were, she said. And I knew you'd know too. Petra Voss was 44, the founder and CEO of Voss Dynamics, a performance engineering consultancy that had made her a very specific kind of wealthy, not the kind that got written about in lifestyle magazines, but the kind that let her buy things most people didn't know were for sale. She had worked alongside Tanner at Meridian for 3 years before leaving to start her own firm. They had disagreed frequently and productively about almost everything. She was one of the best engineers he had ever known, and one of the most difficult people he had ever liked. "What do you want me to do with them?" he said. "Restore them," she said. "As many as are viable. I have a buyer lined up for the set if we can certify them to original spec." "What kind of buyer?" "The kind who pays a great deal of money for things with provenance." He looked at the row of engines in his parking lot. A car slowed on the road outside. The driver looking over at the strange sight of 7 large engine blocks sitting outside a small-town garage. "I'm going to need parts," he said. "I'll cover costs," Petra said, "and I'll pay you for the labor. Properly." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll look at them," he said. "I'm not making any promises." "You never did," she said, and he could hear something in her voice that might have been a smile or might have been something else entirely, and then she was gone again. Rosalind came by the garage after school that day and stood at the bay door looking at the engines with her arms crossed, the same way she looked at everything new, careful, considering, not yet willing to commit to an opinion. "What are those?" she said. "Engines," he said. "I know they're engines, Dad. M7 series, racing engines. I helped design the original spec when you were about 4. She walked over and looked at the nearest one more closely. She didn't touch it. She had learned early that there was a right way and a wrong way to approach things in the shop, and she applied that lesson to most situations in her life. "They look kind of wrecked," she said. "They look worse than they are. Is that why you're keeping them?" He glanced at her. She was still looking at the engine. "Someone's paying me to restore them," he said. "Who? You remember Petra Voss from the old job?" Rosalind turned to look at him then, and there was something in her expression that he couldn't quite read, which happened more often now that she was 13. "The one you used to argue with on the phone," she said. "We didn't argue, Dad. You argued. We had technical disagreements. You raised your voice. I was passionate about the subject matter." She turned back to the engine. "Is she nice?" "She's—" He stopped. "She's very competent." Rosalind nodded slowly, in the way that meant she had already drawn her own conclusions and wasn't going to share them. "I'll make pasta," she said, and went inside through the door that connected the garage to the back of the building where they'd set up a small kitchen and a sitting room, because the apartment above was where they actually lived, but Rosalind liked to do her homework in the back, where she could hear him working. He stood alone in the garage bay for a moment, looking at the 7 engines, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope exactly. Something older than hope. The particular alertness of a man who recognizes, in a neglected thing, a problem worth solving. He pulled on his gloves and got to work. The first 2 weeks were assessment. He went through each engine methodically, the way he'd been trained to work, not rushing toward the interesting parts, building the full picture first. He documented everything. He ordered a case of coffee from the diner on Main Street and set up a folding table near the bay door where he spread his notes and his reference materials, the original M7 spec sheets he still had on a thumb drive from his Meridian days. 3 of the 7 engines were in better condition than they appeared. The corrosion was surface level. The seized components were frozen by years of inactivity rather than damage. And the internal tolerances, when he got bore gauges on them, were still within spec. He felt something close to satisfaction when the numbers came up clean. Like finding out a long-rumored story was actually true. 2 more were viable with significant work. One needed a complete head rebuild. The other had damage to the lower block that would require sourcing a replacement casting. The 6th engine was the one with the heat damage, and after 3 days of careful examination, he concluded it was the only true loss. The warping had gone too deep. He set it aside and didn't look at it again. The 7th was strange. It was the cleanest of the lot externally, which should have made it the easiest. But when he got inside it, the internal configuration was subtly different from the others. Not wrong, exactly. Different, like a variation on a theme played in a lower key. He sat with it for 2 days, going back through his notes, cross-referencing the original program documents, and on the evening of the second day, he sat down and called Petra. "The seventh engine," he said. "Tell me about it." A silence. A specific kind of silence that told him she already knew. "That one's different," she said. "I noticed. It was a late program prototype," she said. "A revised compression configuration that the program director decided not to carry forward. It was never tested at race conditions." "Why not?" "Politics," she said, and her voice had an edge to it. "There was a disagreement about direction. Certain people on the program had invested heavily in the original configuration and weren't interested in validating an alternative." "Was the alternative better?" A pause. "I think you'll be able to tell me," she said. He looked at the seventh engine across the shop floor. The overhead light made the casting look almost golden. "Give me 2 weeks," he said. "You have 3, she said. "But I need to know something first." "What? Has anyone else contacted you? Anyone asking about the engines?" He frowned. "No. Why would they?" Another pause, this one longer. "There are people at Meridian, former Meridian, the company was absorbed last year, who might have an interest in the M7 components, not because they want to use them, because they want to make sure no one else does." "That doesn't make sense," he said. "The program was decommissioned." "Yes," she said. "But if these engines are restored and certified, they carry documented proof that the M7 program produced viable racing hardware. That has implications for certain legal disputes involving the original program patents." He was quiet for a moment, working through the logic of it. "So someone wants them destroyed," he said. "Someone already tried to have them destroyed," she said. "I'm the reason they're in your shop instead of a scrapyard." He looked at the engines again. 6 of them that he believed in. 1 mystery. A phone call that came on a Wednesday. The specific sound of a situation becoming more complicated than advertised. "I'll call you if anyone reaches out," he said. "Thank you, Tanner." "Don't thank me yet." The call came on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into the work, the 6 engines stripped down and in various stages of rebuilding, the 7th one dismantled on his main workbench with its revised compression geometry laid out in a way he'd been studying every morning before Rosalind woke up. It was a man named Breck Leland who introduced himself as a representative of something called the Alderton Performance Group, which Tanner had never heard of. He had a smooth, careful voice and the particular vocabulary of someone who had practiced sounding reasonable. "Mr. Hollis," he said, "we understand you've recently taken possession of a set of M7 series components originally belonging to the Meridian Automotive Program." Tanner set down the micrometer he was holding. "I'd be careful about the word belonging," he said. "My understanding is that those components have no current owner." "That's one interpretation," Leland said. "The Alderton Group holds certain licensing rights connected to the original M7 program documentation. We believe any surviving hardware may fall under that licensing structure." "You might want to have your lawyers write that down somewhere official," Tanner said. "Because right now it just sounds like a phone call." A pause. The kind of pause that people inserted deliberately to suggest they had more patience than you. "We'd be willing to compensate you for your time," Leland said. "Whatever you've spent on labor and materials, we'll cover it at rate and add a reasonable finder's fee. The simplest outcome for everyone would be for you to hand over the components, to you, to the Alderton Group. And what does the Alderton Group plan to do with them?" "That's not really. I'm going to need an answer to that question," Tanner said, "before this conversation goes any further." Another pause. "We'd return them to the appropriate disposition process, which is what you're calling the scrapyard." Silence. "I'll think about it," Tanner said and hung up. He called Petra within the minute. "Breck Leland," he said. "Alderton Performance Group." He heard her exhale. "How much did he offer you?" "Didn't get that far. He said he'd cover my costs plus a finder's fee." "He'll call back with a number," she said. "Whatever he offers, it'll sound like a lot. It won't be close to what the engines are actually worth." "Who are these people?" "The Alderton Group was formed 18 months ago from the remains of Meridian's executive management team after the absorption," she said. 3 of them were on the original M7 program. They pushed to have the hardware destroyed because of the patent dispute I mentioned. There's a lawsuit from a former program engineer who claims the original configuration was derived from his prior work without credit. "Was it?" "Partially," she said. "That engineer's name is Gareth Sewell. He spent 6 years trying to get Meridian to acknowledge it. The company folded before anything was resolved. Now the Alderton people are trying to get the same deal through the new structure, and they're terrified of any surviving documentation that validates the M7 hardware. Because Sewell's lawyers have argued the program's success proves the value of what was taken from him. Tanner sat down on his shop stool. So the 7th engine, he said. If the 7th engine performs to its revised specification, Petra said, it's documented proof that the engineering Sewell contributed was not just viable, but superior. It changes the damages calculation in his lawsuit by several orders of magnitude. How much are we talking about? His attorneys estimate somewhere between 8 and 12 million, she said. The Alderton Group's exposure, split 3 ways, is significant. Tanner looked at the 7th engine on his bench, the revised compression geometry, the variant that had been politically inconvenient, the design that certain people had worked very hard to make sure nobody ever tested. They're going to come at this harder, he said. Yes, Petra said. I think they are. And you knew this when you called me. A pause. I knew there was a risk, she said. I thought you deserved to know what you were actually looking at, what it was actually worth. You could have told me up front. Would you have taken the job? He didn't answer that. Tanner, she said, and her voice had shifted, gone quieter. I'm sorry I put you in this position. If you want to give them back, I'll make sure you're covered. I won't hold you to anything. He looked at the engines, 6 in various stages of restoration, each one showing, under the grime and the years, the precision of what had been built there. The 7th one spread out on his bench like a puzzle he already understood, that had been waiting to be solved by someone who spoke the right language. I'm going to need my documentation in order, he said. Every step of the assessment and restoration. Photographed and time-stamped. I'll have my attorney. I'll handle it, he said. But I need Gareth Sewell's contact information. And I need to understand exactly what the legal situation requires. A silence. You're going to finish them. I'm going to finish them, he said. Leland called back 4 days later with a number. It was $47,000, which was designed to sound substantial and was in fact about a sixth of what Tanner had by then calculated the certified engines would be worth on the open market. He told Leland he needed time to consider it. Leland gave him 48 hours in the tone of someone conferring a generous gift. 2 days after that, Tanner arrived at the garage at 6 in the morning to find the lock on the side entrance broken. His documentation, the printed notes he'd been keeping on the workbench, had been gone through, pages out of order, 2 folders missing. The engines themselves were untouched. Whoever had come in the night had been looking for paperwork, not hardware. He stood in the middle of the shop for a long moment, looking at the disarray. Then he took out his phone and called the Clover Falls Police Department. He filed a report with a deputy named Albright, who was professionally skeptical but wrote everything down. Then he called Petra and told her what had happened. They're getting desperate, she said. Or they're getting organized, he said. Which is worse? He spent that day setting up a camera system, 3 units covering the bay doors and the workbench area. He moved his primary documentation to a cloud backup that synced automatically. He made a copy of everything and mailed it, physical copies, to his sister in Knoxville, with a note telling her to hold on to it and not ask questions. She called him immediately and asked questions. He answered approximately half of them. He did not tell Rosalind about the break-in. She was 13 and perceptive and would worry, and the worry would distract him. He made the pasta that night because it was his turn, and she told him it was better than last time, which was technically true because last time he'd burnt it. She was doing her homework at the kitchen table when she said, without looking up from her notebook, "Something happened." He looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "You're being too normal," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Someone broke into the shop last night," he said. "They didn't take anything important. I've got cameras now." She looked up at him then, and he saw her doing the thing she'd learned from him, not reacting immediately, processing first. "Is it because of the engines?" she said. "Yes. Is it going to be okay?" He thought about the right answer for a moment. The honest answer versus the reassuring answer. He'd been choosing wrong on that particular question for most of her life, defaulting to the reassuring one, and then watching her figure out the truth on her own and trust him slightly less each time. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'm handling it and I know what I'm doing." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, a small, certain nod, and went back to her homework. He thought about Beth. He thought about her a lot, in the way you think about someone who is no longer there to tell you whether you're doing the right thing. Beth had been better at people than he was. She would have known what to say to Leland on the first call. She would have known exactly how much to tell Rosalind. He was making guesses, mostly. He hoped they were good ones. Gareth Sewell was 61 years old and lived in a small house outside Chattanooga that was overrun with houseplants and engineering texts. He had the careful, deliberate manner of someone who had spent years being disbelieved and had learned to build his case slowly and thoroughly. When Tanner drove down to meet him and laid out what he'd found in the seventh engine, Sewell looked at the photographs and the measurement data and didn't say anything for a long time. "That's the modified compression geometry," he said finally. "I know," Tanner said. I figured that out from the spec sheets." "I proposed that modification in 2015, Sewell said. "I have the original documentation. They said it wasn't worth pursuing." "It's worth pursuing," Tanner said. "Based on what I'm seeing, if this engine runs to its potential, you're looking at a 7 to 9% efficiency gain over the baseline configuration. At racing conditions, that's significant." Sewell looked at him carefully. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because the people trying to suppress this information broke into my shop," Tanner said, "and I don't respond well to that." Sewell was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can you get the engine running?" "Give me 6 weeks," Tanner said. He told Leland's 48-hour deadline to expire without calling back. 3 days later, he received a letter from an attorney representing the Alderton Performance Group, asserting a claim of ownership over the M7 hardware and demanding its return. He sent a copy to Petra's attorney, who sent back a response that was 8 pages long and used the word meritless 4 times. He finished the first 3 engines in week 5. He photographed each one, documented the restoration steps, ran bench tests where he could. The results were exactly what he'd expected, well within original spec, the kind of performance numbers that made a certain kind of person sit up straight. He sent the certification documents to Petra. She called him within an hour. "The buyer wants to meet," she said. "Who is it?" "A collector named Hadley Vane. He has a motorsport museum in North Carolina. He's been looking for M7 hardware for 3 years. How much?" "For a certified set of 6, she said. "He's prepared to offer $2.4 million. Tanner sat down. "That's—" "Yes," Petra said. He was quiet for a moment. "And if we can certify the 7th one?" "Tanner," she said, and her voice was careful. "If the 7th engine runs and the performance data matches what you're projecting, Sewell's case changes significantly. The Alderton Group knows that. They're going to push harder once they find out the engine is being tested." "I know," he said. "Are you ready for that?" He looked at the 7th engine. It was nearly complete now. He had rebuilt it with the care of someone who understood what he was actually holding. Not just an engine, but an argument. Evidence. The physical form of something that had been said and then silenced. "I'll be ready," he said. The test was on a Saturday morning early, before the town was fully awake. He'd borrowed a proper engine dynamometer from a friend who ran a performance shop in Murfreesboro, and he'd set it up in the bay with Rosalind's help the night before. She hadn't asked many questions during the setup. She had handed him tools when he asked and held things steady when he needed them held and said, when they were finally done, "This is a big deal, isn't it?" It wasn't a question. "It might be," he said. She nodded. "I'm going to be here tomorrow morning." "You don't have to." "I know," she said, and she went upstairs to bed. She was there at 6:15 the next morning, in her jacket and a coffee mug, sitting on a stool by the bay door. He hadn't asked her to stay quiet. She just understood the moment required it. The engine started on the 3rd crank. It idled rough for the first 30 seconds, which was expected after years of dormancy, and then it smoothed out into something even and deep and certain. Tanner stood and listened to it for a long moment before he began the testing sequence. The numbers came up clean, cleaner than clean. The revised compression geometry performed exactly as Sewell's 2015 documentation had projected. Better, even, at the upper end of the RPM range. 7.8% efficiency gain over baseline at race conditions. The kind of number that ended arguments. He ran the full test sequence twice to make sure. The engine ran both times without fault. He shut it down and stood in the quiet of the shop for a moment, listening to the cooling tick of the block. Rosalind said from her stool. Good? Very good, he said. She raised her coffee mug slightly. He raised his in return. The documentation package went to Sewell's attorneys that afternoon. Petra coordinated with Hadley Vane's team. The Alderton Group's lawyers sent 2 more letters in the following week, each one less confident than the last, like a retreating tide. When the full evidentiary packet, restoration records, test data, certification documentation, chain of custody from Petra's original acquisition landed in the hands of the court overseeing Sewell's case, the Alderton Group filed for mediation within 48 hours. The settlement was reached 6 weeks later. The details were confidential, but Sewell's attorney called Tanner to thank him personally, and the number she mentioned without quite saying it out loud was large enough that Tanner had to find a place to sit down. Hadley Vane acquired the 6 certified M7 engines for the agreed price. The 7th was a separate transaction. It went to Sewell himself, who intended to donate it to an engineering museum in Detroit with a full provenance document attached. The engine that had been designed to disappear would be behind glass with a placard telling the accurate story of who had designed it and why it mattered. Tanner split the labor compensation with the overhead costs, cleared his supplier accounts, and put the remainder in 2 places, a savings account and a college fund that he'd been underfunding since the move to Clover Falls. The college fund was now, for the first time, something that could reasonably be called a fund. Petra called him on a Thursday evening. He was in the garage, back on the Silverado that had been waiting patiently through the entire 7-engine ordeal. Vane's team confirmed receipt of all 6, she said. They're very happy. Good, he said. Tanner. A pause. Thank you. For finishing it. You knew I would, he said. I hoped, she said. That's different. He thought about that for a moment. Outside, the street was quiet in the way Clover Falls got quiet in the evening, which was a different kind of quiet from Detroit, or from anywhere he'd been before. Unhurried, certain of itself. Are you planning to come down this way sometime? He said. It came out more direct than he'd intended. He didn't take it back. A beat of silence. I might have some business in Nashville in the spring, she said. Clover Falls is about 40 minutes from Nashville, he said. I know where Clover Falls is, she said, and there was something in her voice he couldn't name, or maybe could name, and was being careful about. Then you know where to find me, he said. He went back to work. The Silverado's problem was a cracked exhaust manifold, simple enough once you knew what you were listening for. He found it in 20 minutes, put in an order for the part, and closed up the bay for the night. Upstairs, Rosalind was at the kitchen table with her homework and a half-eaten bowl of cereal. She looked up when he came in. Done? She said. For tonight, he said. She went back to her notebook. He started making dinner. The apartment above the garage was small and slightly crooked in the way of old buildings, and the kitchen light had a flicker that he'd been meaning to fix for 2 years, and outside the window the town was doing what small towns do in October, pulling itself inward, settling in for the season. He cracked 3 eggs into a pan and thought about the 7th engine, about the way it had sounded when it finally ran, about the particular satisfaction of a thing that had been hidden turning out to be exactly as good as someone had always known it was. Some things, he thought, just need the right person and the right time, and someone who refuses to let it go to the scrapyard. He slid the eggs onto plates and called Rosalind to dinner, and she came without being asked twice, which was, on that particular Thursday evening, enough.